All right, everybody, welcome back. So this is part 2 of your week 2 lesson, looking at chapters 3 and 4. So where we left off was talking about the Tuskegee syphilis study, some very, very terrible things that happened in the U.S. At the hands of the U.S. government. Now, so unfortunately, this does illustrate the importance of participant collaboration. This is a very extreme example. This was not something that was done by community psychology, but it is an example of a piece of science, right, quote unquote, that caused a lot of harm. And we never want to do harm to our research participants. All right, so question number 3, how do we understand the cultural and social contexts of the research? This is a really important question for us in community psychology because, of course, we work with people who do come from very diverse backgrounds. And so it could be, a different locality, a different region in the world that we're looking at. It could be working with people who have different ethnicities, etc., who might belong to a different religious group, etc. So we want to make sure that we are doing our research with a good understanding of cultural and social variables, understanding cultural and social contexts. Now, one of the things that we're concerned about in community psychology is not falling into what we call a methodological trap, right? Which is a problem or assumption that a researcher can make if we're not careful. And there are several methodological traps or problems that we can make as researchers that are cultural or social. The first one is an assumption that everyone who comes from a certain cultural background is alike or has similar thoughts or opinions about things. So we'll talk about that one in a moment. And then the second one, which I'll also get into a little bit more detail in a moment, is that measures or terminology mean the same thing across cultures. So let's talk about the first methodological trap, that all members of a cultural group or social group are alike. Now, we know that we need to be very careful to avoid making these kinds of assumptions, right? That, this is an example, for example, of Canadian First Nations people, Indigenous population within Canada. And, we know that people, just because they identify as First Nations or Native Canadian, that they probably do not think the same things about, their religion, their political beliefs, etc., that there is diversity within this group. Now, one of the things, unfortunately, that we sometimes see happening is that people make assumptions that just because you come from a certain political or social or cultural background, that you must all think the same or feel the same or behave in similar ways. Now, this is a problem because it can lead to stereotypes, of course, and that can lead to prejudice and bias and all of these other more serious issues. So we want to make sure that we're being very careful about that. We also want to make sure that we understand that measures don't mean the same things necessarily across cultures. We want to avoid making this assumption. The way that we are using this term measure is a noun, right? So in psychology, when we use this word measure this way, essentially we're talking about something that we use to measure something. And the main way that we use to measure things in psychology is through a survey or a questionnaire that somebody can respond to and let us know what they think about a certain thing that we're interested in studying, like poverty or homelessness or depression. We have measures that allow us to ask people questions about these kinds of things that we're interested in. So what we know is that measures, like a questionnaire or a survey, that they don't always translate across cultures. We know that words in English, if we were just to translate them into another language, that they might not actually translate as well as we hoped they would, because words have cultural contexts and that can lead to misunderstandings. And the reason why a misunderstanding in research is so important is that it can make our research data invalid, right? If somebody fills out our questionnaire and misunderstands what we mean by something, that means that the data that they're giving us, their thoughts and feelings about something, that it's not actually accurate for how we are hoping to measure that particular phenomenon. The other thing is that people in our culture, in Western cultures in North America, we're very used to filling out surveys. That's just kind of a normal part of our culture. You know, you flip open a magazine and it's got a survey about XYZ things that, you might do a survey to evaluate your experience in our course, etc. Now, this might not be quite as familiar in other cultures, so we have to keep that in mind. Question number 4, we're moving right along here. Of course, we're always interested in the ecological levels of analysis. These never go away for us in community psychology. So we know that this is one of our main values. We're interested in studying social and psychological issues from multiple levels. And so when we start a research project in community psychology, we have to understand what ecological levels of analysis are we interested in studying this particular issue from, right? Because we can't always look at all of the different levels of analysis. Sometimes we can only really look at 1 or 2 of them, because the different issues that we're interested in studying can become quite big. So let's take the example of a researcher who wants to study child abuse or maltreatment, right? So how might we approach a research study about this topic, a very serious social issue, from different ecological levels of analysis? Well, maybe if we study it from an individual perspective, we're going to interview people who have experienced this to understand the long-term effects that it has had on their lives. Now, these are all hypothetical examples, right? But these are examples of how we might go about studying a social issue like child abuse from these different levels. From a microsystem level, we might test the effectiveness of a positive parenting class. There are a number of really amazing initiatives that have been used with families that have experienced child abuse or neglect or some form of maltreatment, and it's helped them to stay together as a family and to be happy and productive, and for the kids ultimately to be safe in that family. So we might go about it that way. We might study organizational approaches to looking at child abuse. What we might do is look at a curriculum that has been designed to educate kids about how and why to report abuse if it's happening to themselves or maybe to a classmate. We might look at localities. We're going to talk about this one in a little bit more detail when we get into our Chapter 4 material, but perhaps we're going to look at rates of emergency room visits for child abuse by geographical area, right? Is there a significant difference between one community versus another community? What's going on in one community that's leading to more visits for child abuse to the emergency room versus another community? What kinds of resources might we be able to put into that community to help, right? So that's an example. And then, of course, looking at macro systems. So, for example, a social movement or a government, maybe there's some sort of national ad campaign that we can roll out to help encourage parents to manage their anger more effectively if they start to lose their patience with their kids. Totally normal, right? But what we know is that we need to help parents to manage their frustration rather than to act out violently. So these would be some examples of how we could study one very serious social issue like child abuse from multiple levels of analysis. So let's do a quick review of Chapter 3. We looked at the value of empirical grounding, some of our identifying how our values impact our work in community psychology. We talked about the importance of community participation in promoting collaboration. We talked about the importance of understanding social and cultural contexts and some of these methodological traps that we can fall into if we're not careful. And then, of course, we ended things off looking at the ecological levels of analysis and how they're important for us when we begin a research study. So that's a little bit of the introduction into some of the important principles for you guys to be aware of for conducting research in community psychology. What I'd like to do now is a quick introduction to some of the research methods that we use in community psychology. So this is specifically how we go about doing the research. So we talked about, some of the introductory concepts that we use to get us thinking about research in community psychology, some of those questions that we need to ask ourselves. When we talk about research methods specifically, this is exactly how we go about collecting information or data from research participants so that we can learn about these different issues that we're interested in studying. So, number one, we always let our research questions guide how we select our research methods. So that's why it's important to do all of that preparatory work that we just learned about in the Chapter 3 material, right? We need to think through exactly what our aims are for studying what we are hoping to study. Because, let's just backtrack for a few slides. Say we're interested in doing this study. That's going to be a very different study than this study, right? And the research methods that we're going to use for this study, that's going to be an interview, we're going to sit down with people, etc. This is going to be more high-scale demographic statistics, that kind of thing. So the research questions always guide the research methods. Let's look at some examples. I know there's a lot of text on this slide. These are just research questions or example research questions for studying something like a social issue like bullying. So bullying is a topic, it's a social issue that is very serious right now. It's affecting a lot of people. And these are some of the research questions that we might ask ourselves if we're interested in studying bullying. For example, what's the relationship between poverty and bullying? Do people who come from an abusive family have a higher likelihood of being bullies or being bullied? Is there a relationship between self-esteem and bullying, etc.? Now, each one of these research questions would be studied differently, right? We would take a different approach to studying each one of these research questions, and it would dictate a different approach. So let's talk about the different methods that are available to us in community psychology for studying the different kinds of issues that we're interested in learning about. So the two main methods that we use to study our research issues and collect data, so data is just our big fancy psychological word for information, right? How we collect our information from our research participants. So we have two main methods. They are qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative research is conducted through words, right? It's conducted through hearing people's thoughts and perspectives. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the specific methods that are involved in collective or qualitative research. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is doing research through numbers, like statistical analysis. So what we're going to look at next are the different methods, qualitative and quantitative, and that's where we will end things off for today. So stay tuned for part 3 of your week 2 material.